Good morning. Buongiorno. If you want to stand up and stretch, I think you had a lot of discussion. If you want to take a deep breath. I'm going to talk about universities. We're at a university here. Many of the speakers earlier talked about things like capacity building, changing the government, changing institutions, and I think we can start with universities. Universities are important for generating the knowledge that the companies need, that the functionaries that will go to government need to be trained. So this is where it happens. We are at ground zero. This is where companies come out of universities, entrepreneurs come out of universities. Research and great science is done at universities, and social problems are solved. So this is really for you. I think this is Then I'd like to talk about the role of universities in innovation. As the first speaker said, companies make innovations, but a lot of the knowledge that companies, the marketplace needs for innovation come from the universities. So there's a lot of interest now in governments and interest in how to encourage, how to incentivize the students, the faculty, the rectors at the universities to engage with the society, not just produce the scientific research, which you're paid to do, which you want to do, but also in terms of the community. There's social problems, there's aging populations in the region, there's water, those other issues. There's also business opportunities that the digitalization is offering everyone. So I think that is something we want to do. I want to talk also about the change in commercialization policies. I think there's been a lot of expectations, maybe high expectations, that universities will be commercializing their research, but maybe there's better ways to do it, so we can talk about that. I also want to talk about open science and open innovations. Some of you that maybe are very savvy with IT, are familiar with open source, but open science is about sharing and access to the scientific articles. Open innovation is also linking the different actors in the innovation process. And then some new directions, some conclusions for reflection for the panel. There's a lot of money being invested in R&D in companies and in the public sector. This is an index. And since the 80s, the amount of money in R&D has increased very strongly, both in the public and the private sector. Now, in the little broken line is the business spending on R&D. Business spending on R&D, and the solid line is the public R&D. So you see that during, for example, there's certain events that happened. There's the dot-com bubble from the 1990s, and you saw the business R&D going down, but the public maintaining its support for research. Even in the financial crisis, the companies stopped, lowered investments in R&D, but the public sector continued. But nowadays, the public sector is having some difficulties. We have slow growth in many OECD countries. We have low productivity. So the public budgets are under pressure. If we try to break it up by countries, some of the slides I just showed you, some countries are maintaining their public spending. So countries like Korea, Germany, Japan, Italy and France are struggling. The spending for public support to R&D has been going down. And when we break up the public spending on research, governments support it two ways. One, by the national research centers like the CNR in Italy, and others through the universities. And we see that in most countries, most of the money is now going to the universities. So a lot of public money for research is going to universities. So a lot of expectations that this research will lead to innovation, will solve social problems. So again, universities are becoming the central point. But universities are very diverse. Some of them very much academic and have a universal ambition of teaching philosophy, humanities, science. Others are more focused on applied sciences, engineering schools. Some are more focused on a region, the local community. Some are competing globally. They want to attract the best professors. They want to be on the map, if you like. There's also extreme differences across subject and field. So I think this issue of diversity is very important. Now, there's a risk that sometimes some of the policies see the universities as one entity, one institution. And I think this is something that you would probably agree you have to defend this diversity. You see, as in Europe, you have a large number of types of higher education institutions. The universities being in the dark bar, and the pink one, the universities of applied sciences and other kinds of tertiary education institutions in the green. So I think Italy is very much divided between the universities and the other higher education institutions. Of course, this diversity is very much tied to the historical, cultural factors, the infrastructure, so this is very difficult to change. On the one hand, you have your history in Trieste with this university. You have famous scientists and writers that emerged from here. So you have a cultural heritage, but you also have to think about the future. And I think this is something that's a challenge in terms of the universities. One of the issues is also how to engage with the companies. And of course, we see that the government funding, as I said, is going down. So there's efforts to increase the amount of funding from charities, philanthropies, foundations, but also companies. But still, over time, when you look at the data, the company support for R&D in the universities is rather limited, around 10 to 15% in the best cases. In the case of Germany, for example, where we know a lot of the higher education institutions work very directly with companies. But there are some common trends. I think all the universities have experienced this massification, the increase of students. They've all affected by digitalization, online learning, international cooperation and competition as well, I think is another common challenge for universities. And also competition for funding, increasingly a challenge for the universities. And then the issue of the missions. Universities have an education mission, a research mission, but increasingly the other activities, the engagement, the innovation activities, increasingly a lot of governments are putting more policy pressure on the universities to go in this direction. So we've seen that the research funding becomes much more based on excellence, competitive research, less funding in terms of the block or institutional funding. There's also a more applied orientation, market orientation for some of the research, and this need to formalize the third mission. And one of the ways to formalize it is to promote this commercialization of transfer. I'm sure that Trieste has a TTO, I'm sure. So this is one of the main policy trends over the past 15 years has been to promote this function of the university. But again, just like I said, universities are different. Also at the country level, as we saw from the other speakers, some country innovation system is more characterized by public labs. Like in the French system, it's quite mixed. You have a lot of government, the CNRS, a lot of the French government labs that do a lot of research jointly with universities. So you have some systems that are public research centers, others that are more university centered, others that are more company centered. So a lot of, for example, in Japan, a lot of the R&D is actually done by companies, not by the public sector. So I think this is an important element for policymakers. So who are the policymakers behind this commercialization? I think we have several levels of governance here. One, of course, being the ministries the agencies that administer the funding, and then of course the universities themselves and the structures that they create to commercialize technology. And this is sort of a map of some of the main pieces of the framework that you need. Of course, some of the knowledge that is transferred from universities is maybe an invention, but a lot of it is not. There's many different ways of the knowledge is transferred. The best way is transferred through you, the students. That is where most of the knowledge from the university enters the economy as you go to work, as you continue further research. And I think that's also a very important element, and I'll come back to the role of students now in commercializing knowledge. So we have previously focused very much on intellectual property, patents, and licenses, but that's a very limited share. In fact, some data show that that only 4% in the UK, for example, of the relation between the academics in the university and the outside world happens in the form of intellectual property. Most of the other relations happen through conferences, lectures, consulting services that professors may do for companies. So there's a different way of thinking about the relationship with business. In fact, a lot of the problems that universities have experienced with commercialization are pretty much summarized in this example from Finland. Of course, oftentimes the TTO offices have very scarce resources. Oftentimes they're very inward-looking and not very much focused on the outside. The commercialization as an activity is not rewarded in the academic world. So you're rewarded if you're cited in Science and New England Journal School of Medicine, but you're not rewarded for patenting of these activities. It's difficult to identify which research findings can be used. Increasingly, because of the open science and open access, you're using open source, but in terms of engaging companies, they want propriety, they want control over the data and information. So that's another challenge. So what are the solutions? What are we seeing now in countries? I think that the legal framework is still important, and maybe even in some of the catching up countries, this is still a basic condition of clarifying who owns the IPR. Leadership and the vision, I think that's also important. In some universities, for example, in Denmark, the technical university has made commercialization a main objective of the university mission. You go on the website and it says education, research, and commercialization. That's very different from many universities where it's very much a low priority activity. So that leadership is very important. Financing and providing proof of concept. A lot of universities now support the on-campus activities through some financing prototyping tools. Tutoring and entrepreneurship and academic students. A lot of focus in the past was on the professor. Now the focus is more on the undergraduates, the master's students, and giving them a space. And some universities actually have warehouses where people can take 3D printers and create things and develop ideas. There are coaches to help you test some of your ideas. Also, the TTOs themselves have changed their management approach. They were previously very much administrative to the university, serving the scientific community, but now they've expanded more their mission on partnerships with the companies, providing consulting services. And they've also, some of them have been merged between universities, so maybe one university will handle the tech transfer for other higher education institutions nearby. So this is a kind of hub and spoke model. There's also new types of TTOs emerging. Private ones have emerged, partnerships. As I said, this is a for-profit technology transfer office in Denmark. There's also internet-based models that we see in North America. And what we call the free agency model is emerging. In the US, for example, if a researcher at Berkeley wants to commercialize some research but finds that the best place for this is probably another technology transfer office in another state, They try to take this to the other state and have it commercialized where the market is, where the other network technology is. And city-based, a lot of cities have become very engaged in entrepreneurship, and some countries like the UK and Korea, they have these innovation centers and they're working with universities on commercialization. Of course, and I think that's important because a lot of patents that universities produce actually just sit on the shelf. They're the sleeping patents. They cost money. So in many cases now, some universities are saying we want to license freely, we want to get the knowledge out on a non-exclusive basis, and focusing specifically on SMEs. Another trend in commercialization is the education link. As I said, a lot of the focus was on trying to link the scientific people in the university with the companies, but now it's about linking the students with the companies. The place-based, practice-based learning, research training for the undergraduates, and education partnerships. We talk about business research partnerships for research, but education partnerships. So that brings me to the entrepreneurship. I think that's on campus. The entrepreneurial university is maybe a buzzword, but it means a change where the universities are actually practicing entrepreneurship through workshops and seminars and campus initiatives. And there's many examples around the world, in Finland, in the US. This is one example from Germany. This is their ecosystem for the entrepreneurial university at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, where the students are really important here, the mentoring, the coaching. My last point would be about open science. I think that this one, especially the open data, at a time of big data, some of you are doing some research, you're working with data. Managing this data, having access to it is becoming more important for research itself, but also for companies. Every time you use your phone, data is collected about you, about your behavior, your consumer behavior. And there's also both positive impacts in terms of science, but also in companies. In fact, in the US, when the White House made a legislation on access to the federally funded research results, it specifically focused on access by companies. So it's not just access by the scientists. Of course, not all scientific disciplines are very active in the open access at this point. It's more common in medicine, related to biotechnology industry and chemistry. Physics is very well advanced in the open science and open data. But in other fields, it's really a lack of awareness. And this is maybe an issue for the humanities and other fields where open science, their sharing can also have some potential benefits. There's still barriers around this issue, the open data, but I think it's important that universities develop a chief information officer, that they have data management plans, that they have incentives for the researchers to share data. There's a lot of barriers, but there's also a lot of solutions. So my conclusion, I think I'm out of time. I think the higher education institutions, universities, make a huge contribution to innovation, but the focus of policy has been very narrow on the commercialization. The indicators we use to benchmark has been very narrow, so we have to maybe revisit some of those issues. We also have to look at different channels for engaging with the society, the consulting, the contracts, the students, and all this in a very much a place-based dimension. I think that's something I didn't mention, but a lot of the issue is also around the territorial. We are a Trieste University, there's a Trieste industrial structure, so how can Trieste contribute to that? As I said, the leadership and the management at universities and making sure that the open science has a high priority. And institutional experimentation. I think, as Professor Stefan said, governments also have to innovate in the way they govern, but universities have to start becoming more innovative themselves. It's not just fostering innovation in the companies, but becoming innovative in the way they administer and manage and the way they teach. And I think that is one important way that we can move forward. More information on our work on universities and innovation from this website and my contact. Thank you very much. Grazie.